The morning started like any other at the department. I was cleaning my gear in the ready room, half listening to Officer Thompson complain about his new keto diet. When the call came in at 8:45 a.m., the dispatch tone was different, urgent, tense. I'd been on the force for 12 years, and you develop a sense for when something's truly wrong. All available SWAT units, we have a code 3 at Roosevelt High School. Multiple reports of disturbance. School is initiating lockdown procedures. I was already moving before dispatch finished speaking, muscle memory taking over as I secured my vest. What caught my attention was the dispatcher's voice. Jessica was usually unflappable, but there was an edge I'd never heard before. More details came through as we loaded into the tactical vehicle. Multiple 911 calls from teachers, strange noises from the basement level, students exhibiting erratic behavior, principal requesting immediate response. But it was the last transmission that made my blood run cold. Be advised, we've lost contact with School Resource Officer Davis. Last transmission mentioned unusual circumstances. Thompson looked at me as we sped toward Roosevelt, lights flashing. Davis is solid. 20 years on the force. What gets to a guy like that? The radio crackled again. A teacher's voice, barely controlled panic. They're not themselves, the students. Something's wrong with their eyes. Oh God, the noises they're making. Static consumed the transmission. As we turned onto Cedar Street, Roosevelt High came into view. The modern 3-story building usually bustled with life, but now it stood silent. Dark clouds had gathered overhead, unusual for what had been a clear morning. The American flag hung limp in the dead air. Command, be advised we have no visible activity around the perimeter, I reported, scanning the grounds. Building appears secured, no signs of. I stopped. Something was wrong with the entrance doors. We pulled closer and I felt my chest tighten. Carved into the heavy steel doors were symbols I'd never seen before. They looked ancient, crude, like they'd been etched with desperate fingers. Yet the metal seemed freshly scored. Thompson, Rivera, establish perimeter north. Jackson, take Mitchell east, I ordered, falling into protocol even as my instincts screamed that this was anything but a standard call. Anderson, you're with me on main entrance assessment. The school security system showed all doors were locked, not just secured, but sealed somehow. Temperature readings made no sense, showing patches of extreme cold moving through the building, and the security camera feeds. I'll never forget those images. Empty hallways that seemed to twist at impossible angles, shadows that moved against the light, and in one frame, just for a second, a face that couldn't have been human. Command, we're going to need additional units, I said into my radio. Static answered. All communications were dead. Even our tactical gear was malfunctioning, equipment that had never failed before. That's when we heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams, like hundreds of voices whispering at once, but not in any language I'd ever heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And then, from somewhere deep in the school, a child began to laugh. The laughter faded, leaving us in an unnatural silence. My watch read 9:15 a.m., but the sky had darkened like late evening. Anderson shifted beside me, his breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. Sir, he said, pointing to his tablet, look at these readings. The thermal imaging showed impossible temperature variations throughout the building. Corridors that should have been room temperature displayed patches of extreme cold, some areas registering below zero. But what disturbed me more were the hot spots, shapes that moved like people but burned far too hot for any living thing. Command, be advised we have. I stopped, remembering our communications were down. We were isolated. Protocol dictated we should wait for backup, but something told me we didn't have that luxury. A dull thud echoed from inside, followed by the sound of scraping metal. The security feed showed empty hallways, but movement caught my eye in one frame. A dark mass sliding across the floor, leaving glistening trails that seemed to absorb light. Check the other entrances, I ordered. There has to be a way in. As the team spread out, I studied the symbols carved into the main doors. They seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence, and the longer I looked, the more my head hurt. They reminded me of something I'd seen in my grandfather's old books. He'd been a scholar of ancient religions, always warning about things that existed beyond our understanding. Officer Rivera's voice crackled through our local comms. "Sir, cafeteria loading dock shows signs of recent activity. Doors damaged, but there's something odd about the marks." We regrouped at the loading dock. The heavy metal door was dented outward, like something had tried to break out rather than in. Black liquid, too thick to be water, too cold to be blood, seeped from beneath it. "Standard breach formation," I commanded, pushing aside my growing sense of dread. "Whatever we find in there, we stick together. And for God's sake, check your body cams. We need to document everything." The door yielded to our ram with unexpected ease. The cafeteria beyond lay in chaos, breakfast trays scattered across tables, some still steaming despite the cold. Backpacks and phones littered the floor, many showing the same strange symbols on their screens. "Movement in the kitchen," Anderson whispered, gesturing with his rifle. We advanced slowly, our lights cutting through the gloom. The kitchen equipment was running despite the power being out. Freezers humming at impossible frequencies, ovens cold but somehow glowing from within. A pot of water boiled on a dead stove, the liquid black and thick. That's when we heard it, a voice singing softly. It sounded like a child, but the melody was wrong, discordant. It came from the walk-in freezer. The handle was coated in frost despite the freezer being off. When we pulled it open, the singing stopped. Inside, we found one of the lunch ladies, Mrs. Applegate. I remembered her from my own days at Roosevelt. She stood facing the corner, completely still. "Ma'am," I called out, "this is the police. Are you all right?" She turned slowly, her eyes, God, her eyes. They were solid black, like empty spaces in reality. Her mouth opened in a smile that stretched too wide, showing teeth that had been filed to points. "They're so hungry," she whispered in a voice that wasn't her own. "They've waited so long, and now the feast begins." The freezer door slammed shut behind us. The next few moments were chaos. Anderson slammed his shoulder against the freezer door while Thompson tried to pry it open. The lunch lady, or whatever she had become, laughed that horrible laugh again, the sound echoing off the steel walls. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on our gear. "Breach charge," I ordered, pulling the small explosive from my pack. We had to get out before hypothermia set in. "Everyone back." The charge detonated, but instead of blowing outward, the door imploded, taking a chunk of wall with it. Mrs. Applegate was gone. In her place, carved into the freezer's back wall, was a crude map of the school, with sections we'd never known existed. 9:45 a.m., Rivera muttered, checking his watch. "How is that possible? We were only in there for a minute." Lost time, another bad sign. We needed to move. The hallways beyond the cafeteria were worse than the security feeds had shown. Lockers stood open, their contents spilled across the floor, notebooks open to pages filled with those same disturbing symbols. The walls seemed to pulse in our flashlight beams, and the floor wasn't right. Our boots left impressions in the tile like it was soft, almost organic. A scream echoed from somewhere above us, cutting off abruptly. We found the main stairwell, but the steps appeared to shift and move when viewed directly. Looking at them from the corner of your eye was the only way to be sure of your footing. "First classroom," Thompson whispered, pointing to room 103. The door was barricaded from the outside with desks and chairs. Inside, through the small window, we could see students, at least 20 of them, sitting perfectly still at their desks. They all faced the wall, heads tilted at identical angles. "This is the police," I announced through the door's window. "We're here to evacuate you." Slowly, in perfect unison, every student turned their head 180 degrees to look at us. Their faces were blank, eyes milky white. Their mouths moved in sync, speaking words I couldn't hear but could feel in my bones. "Jesus Christ." Anderson backed away. "Sir, what do we—" A sound from the air vents interrupted him, scratching like thousands of fingernails on metal. Black liquid began dripping from the ceiling, but it fell upward, defying gravity. The temperature dropped again, and our tactical gear started failing, radios emitting high-pitched squeals, flashlights flickering. There, Rivera pointed down the hall. A figure stood in the shadows, small, child-sized but wrong. Its proportions were distorted, limbs too long, head too large. It held something in its hands. "Police, don't move," I commanded, training my rifle on it. The figure stepped forward. It was a student, or had been once. His uniform was soaked in that black liquid, skin pale as paper. In his hands was an old book, its cover made of something that looked disturbingly like human skin. "The doors are open now," he said in multiple voices at once. "They've waited so long in the dark, in the tunnels, below." He smiled, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. "Would you like to meet them?" The hallway lights exploded, plunging us into darkness. When our flashlights finally sputtered back to life, the boy was gone. The book lay open on the floor, its pages filled with photographs, decades of school photos, faces crossed out one by one. And in the distance, growing louder, we could hear what sounded like hundreds of feet running toward us. 10:30 a.m. The sound of running feet grew closer, then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Thompson pulled back the charging handle on his rifle, the click echoing unnaturally loud in the empty hallway. "Those photos go back to the 1950s, Anderson said, examining the book with a shaking hand. Each class photo showed more crossed-out faces as the years progressed. "Look at 1987, the entire senior class." I knew what he meant. Every face was marked, and in the margins were notes in cramped, desperate handwriting. "They're taking them. One by one, the hunger grows." A rhythmic thumping drew our attention to room 104. Through the window, we could see 30 students, all perfectly still except for their heads banging against their desks, in perfect unison. The whiteboard behind them was covered in bizarre markings that seemed to move when you tried to focus on them. "Check every room," I ordered. "We need to find any students who aren't affected." The classrooms told a story of escalating horror. Room 105, empty but student papers covered in identical handwriting, all reading, "The dark below calls." Room 106, students standing in a circle, holding hands, whispering in that strange language. Room 107. "Sir," Rivera called out, his voice trembling, "you need to see this." The water fountain between rooms 107 and 108 was running despite the power outage. Black liquid poured from its spout, moving against gravity, flowing up the walls and across the ceiling. As we watched, it began to form shapes, stick figures at first, then more complex forms that reminded me of ancient cave paintings. They depicted what looked like a ritual, figures bowing before something massive, something with too many limbs. A child's giggle echoed through the halls again, but this time it was answered by dozens more, all slightly out of sync, creating a cacophony that made my teeth ache. The temperature dropped so low our breath crystallized in the air. "Movement," Thompson shouted, spinning toward the main entrance. Through the glass doors we could see figures moving in the parking lot. Parents and news vans had begun to arrive, unaware of what was happening inside. I tried to wave them away, but froze when I saw my reflection in the glass. For a moment, just a split second, my face wasn't my own. Something else looked back at me, something ancient and hungry. The radio on my vest crackled to life, making us all jump. Through the static, we heard a voice. "The seal is breaking. They're almost free. Come below. Come see what has always been here." The voice belonged to Officer Davis, but it was wrong, distorted, like he was speaking through water, and beneath his words, we could hear something else. The sound of stone grinding against stone, and thousands of small feet scurrying through walls. That's when we noticed the floor. The tiles had begun to ripple, like something was moving beneath them, something big, and in the distance, from the direction of the basement stairs, we heard Officer Davis scream. 11:15 a.m. The stairs leading to the basement seemed to stretch down forever, each step taking us further from the natural world. Our flashlight beams caught dancing shadows that moved independently of any source. The air grew thick, making each breath feel like drowning. "Temperature reading impossible," Anderson muttered, checking his equipment. "Shows -40 degrees, but..." But it feels like we're in an oven, Thompson finished. He was right. Sweat poured down our faces despite the cold readings. The basement level opened into a wide maintenance area, filled with ancient boilers and rusted pipes, but something was wrong with the layout. The blueprints showed a simple rectangular space, but the room seemed to curve in impossible ways, corridors branching off that couldn't exist. "Look at the walls," Rivera whispered, running his hand along the exposed foundation. Crude symbols had been carved into every surface, some fresh, others so old they'd become part of the stone. They matched the ones from upstairs, but these felt older, more powerful. A yellowed newspaper clipping fluttered in a non-existent breeze, catching my eye, dated October 1952. 3 Roosevelt students missing, mysterious tunnels discovered during search. Another from 1979, construction halted after workers report strange findings. 1987, entire senior class vanishes without trace. "Sir," Thompson called out from deeper in the basement, "I found something." We followed his voice to the old boiler room. The massive furnace, dead for decades, had been arranged into something else, an altar of twisted metal and rust. Black candles burned with purple flames, and in the center lay Officer Davis's badge, covered in that same black liquid. Our thermal imaging lit up, showing impossible heat signatures moving through the walls around us. They were humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, moving in ways that broke the laws of physics. "My God," Anderson breathed, pointing to a section of wall that had crumbled away. Behind it was an older wall made of rough stone blocks, and beyond that, a tunnel stretched into darkness, its walls lined with bones. Not all of them were old, not all of them were human. Davis's voice echoed from the tunnel. "I understand now. The hunger, the need. They've shown me such wonderful things. Come see, come join us." The ground shook, and from deep below came a sound like gigantic stones grinding together. The bones in the walls began to vibrate, creating a horrible harmony with that awful grinding. A student stepped out of the shadows, the same one from upstairs with the book. But now he moved differently, like a puppet on strings. "The seal weakens," he said in that multi-voice tone. "They are almost free, the ones who built this place, who hungered, who waited. Your ancestors knew them, feared them, fed them." He held out the book again. The pages had changed, now showing architectural drawings of the school dated 1887, but beneath the school was something else, a vast circular chamber filled with writing too small to read. At its center was a pit, and in that pit, Thompson screamed. We spun to see him pointing his flashlight at the ceiling. The black liquid had formed into words. "The feast begins at 12 o'clock. 12 p.m. struck on our watches simultaneously, though time had lost all meaning in this place. The grinding sound stopped, replaced by complete silence. Even the dripping of the black liquid ceased. "Movement," Rivera whispered, his rifle trained on the tunnel entrance. Something was emerging from the darkness, a shape that seemed to change every time you blinked. It flowed like smoke but had substance, reaching out with limbs that shouldn't exist. "Hold your fire," I ordered, though every instinct screamed to shoot. "Davis, if you can hear me, show yourself." A figure stepped through the entity, Davis, but not Davis. His uniform was pristine despite the chaos, but his skin had gone paper white. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere at once. "They were here first," he said, his eyes completely black. "Before the school, before the town, before us. They slept and waited, feeding on small sacrifices, but now they hunger for more." The entity pulsed, stretching toward us. I felt my mind go fuzzy, memories slipping away. Beside me, Anderson dropped to his knees, muttering about the dark spaces between stars. Thompson's nose began to bleed. "Time slips here," Davis continued, his smile too wide. "They showed me everything, past, present, future. It's all the same to them. Did you know this school was built 3 times? 1887, 1923, 1956. Each time they got closer to the surface. Each time more children disappeared." The puppet student appeared again, walking on the ceiling. "Show them," he said. "Show them what you showed me." The entity reached out, touching my forehead with something that felt like ice and fire combined. Reality shattered. I saw Roosevelt High in 1887, watched as workers discovered the first tunnel, saw them seal it away only to have their children drawn back to it. 1923, another discovery, another cover-up. More children taken. 1956, the current building, built on top of the others. The entity growing stronger, spreading through the walls like cancer. The seals, Davis's voice echoed in my vision. 3 sets of seals, placed by those who knew the old ways. But they're breaking now. The hunger is too strong. I snapped back to the present, gasping. Rivera was gone. Thompson lay unconscious. Anderson stood motionless, staring at nothing, black liquid leaking from his eyes. The entity had grown, nearly filling the room. Through its shifting mass, I could see things. Faces, figures, memories. All the missing children from all the years, preserved in its darkness. Soon, the puppet student said, his head twisting completely around. At 3:33, the final seal breaks. They all break, and everyone above. He gestured to the ceiling, where we could hear hundreds of feet moving in unison. The possessed students were gathering, preparing. I checked my watch, 12:45 p.m., less than 3 hours to stop whatever was coming. The journey to the library felt like walking through a nightmare. The hallways twisted, stretched, doubled back on themselves. We dragged Thompson, still unconscious, while Anderson moved like a sleepwalker, muttering about the spaces between walls. Rivera was still missing. The library doors were chained shut with rusted links that looked centuries old. Through the windows, we could see books floating in midair, their pages fluttering without wind. The black liquid had spread here too, forming endless rows of those strange symbols on every surface. The knowledge sleeps here, Davis said, appearing beside us without warning. They let me see it all, every secret, every ritual. Would you like to see? Before I could respond, he touched the chains. They crumbled to dust. Inside, the library had transformed. The normally bright, modern space had become ancient, like some forbidden archive from a medieval monastery. Rows of leather-bound books stretched into impossible darkness. They're all the same book, the puppet student said, now perched on top of a bookshelf. Written again and again, by everyone who found the truth, who tried to stop it, who failed. I grabbed the nearest book. The pages were filled with frantic handwriting in different styles, different languages, all describing the same thing, the entity below. The first entry was dated 1847, before the school existed. They sleep beneath the earth, in spaces that shouldn't be. The natives knew, warned us. We didn't listen, built anyway. Now the children dream of darkness. Another entry, 1923. Second seal placed. Elder Thomas died in the ritual. Says it will hold them for a generation. But the hunger grows. 1956. Final seal complete. 3 bindings, 3 sacrifices. But I fear what I've seen in my son's drawings. They're already finding ways through. Sir, Anderson spoke for the first time in what felt like hours. His eyes were clearer. Look at this. He'd found a hidden room behind a bookshelf. Inside was a map of the town from 1847. The school grounds were marked with a symbol I recognized, the same one carved into the main doors, but it was part of a larger pattern, similar marks at the old church, the town hall, the cemetery. A binding circle, Davis said, the whole town, built to keep them sleeping, but they're awake now, so hungry. The puppet student appeared, holding another book. Time grows short. The seals weaken. Would you like to know why? He opened the book to show photocopied pages from an old diary. A teacher from 1994 found students performing rituals in the basement, caught them just after midnight. They were changing, speaking in voices that hurt to hear, said they were preparing for the feast. The same ritual, Davis whispered. Again and again, drawing them closer, and now it's almost time. Thompson suddenly sat up, his eyes black like Mrs. Applegate's. They're gathering, he said in that horrible multi-voice. Everyone above, ready for the feast, when the final seal breaks. My watch read 1:30 p.m., 2 hours until 3:33. There has to be a way to stop this, I said. Every binding has a counter ritual. Yes, the puppet student smiled his terrible smile. But the price? Are you willing to pay what it costs? They were, all of them, the ones who tried before. He pointed to the corner where shadows moved to reveal a pile of bones, all wearing badges, all from different decades. Time seemed to blur as we searched the hidden archive room. Thompson was conscious but changed, speaking in riddles about the dark between spaces. Anderson had found more journals, each describing failed attempts to stop what was coming. The seals require 3 points, I read from a leather-bound diary dated 1956. The binding draws power from sacred geometry, but the counter-ritual, the price is blood, willing sacrifice. Not just blood, Davis appeared, making us jump. Intent, understanding, acceptance of what lies below. They require tribute freely given. The puppet student danced across the ceiling, trailing black liquid. Tick-tock, he sang in multiple voices. Time grows short. Above, they gather. Such a feast there'll be. A scream echoed from upstairs. Rivera. We ran from the library, following the sound. The hallways had changed again. Lockers bulged outward like something was trying to break free. The floor rippled with each step. We found Rivera in the auditorium. He stood on stage, surrounded by hundreds of students, all moving in perfect unison, all with those horrible black eyes. They were arranging themselves in a pattern I recognized from the binding circle map. Beautiful, isn't it? Rivera's voice echoed wrongly. They showed me such wonderful things in the dark. Would you like to see? The entity flowed from his mouth as he spoke, that same shifting, impossible shape from the basement. It had grown massive, nearly filling the auditorium's height. Through its translucent form, I could see faces, bodies, memories of all it had consumed over decades. The counter-ritual, Anderson said suddenly, his eyes clear again. The journals. It needs 3 points, 3 sacrifices, but with understanding, not just death acceptance. Yes, the puppet student appeared in the balcony. 3 who know, 3 who understand, 3 who choose. I looked at my watch, 2:45 p.m., less than an hour until the final seal broke. The students began to chant in that ancient language. The black liquid flowed faster now, covering every surface. Through the windows, we could see news vans and parents gathered outside, unaware of the horror about to be unleashed. I found this. Anderson held up a final journal entry. The geometry must be completed. 3 points of willing sacrifice, made with full knowledge of what lies below. Their blood marks the points. Their acceptance strengthens the seal. But most importantly, they must choose it freely, knowing what it means, knowing they'll join with them forever. The entity pulsed, reaching toward us with limbs that shouldn't exist. Through its shifting mass, I saw all the failed attempts before. Other officers, other teams, other sacrifices that didn't work because they didn't truly understand what they were facing. Time to choose. Davis smiled his too wide smile. Who will mark the points? Who will join us in the dark? 2:45 p.m. The auditorium had become a nightmare version of itself. The entity towered above us, its mass now filled with swirling faces and fragments of memories from everyone it had taken over the decades. The possessed students continued their chant, the sound making the air itself vibrate. 3 points, I said, looking at Anderson. 3 sacrifices. He nodded, his eyes clear and determined. We understand now. That's why the others failed. They fought it, feared it. We have to accept it. Thompson struggled against whatever was possessing him, moments of clarity breaking through. The pattern. Look at the students. The possessed students had arranged themselves in a massive symbol on the auditorium floor, the same one from the main doors, but now I understood its meaning. It was a door, a gate, a boundary between our world and something else. The first seal breaks, the puppet student sang from the rafters. Black liquid rained down, defying gravity, flowing upward and around us. Rivera, or what used to be Rivera, spread his arms. Join us, see what we've seen, the spaces between walls, the tunnels between time. The entity pulsed, and reality seemed to tear. Through the gaps, I saw impossible things, vast spaces filled with writhing darkness. Ancient chambers deep beneath the earth, ceremonies performed by native tribes centuries ago to keep the hunger bound. The second seal breaks, Davis announced. The ground shook. From beneath the stage came that horrible grinding sound again, like massive stone doors opening. Anderson grabbed my arm. Sir, the journal, the counter ritual, it needs 3 points of the binding circle, 3 sacrifices made with understanding. And acceptance, Thompson added, fighting through his possession. Not just death, we have to choose it, become part of it. The puppet student appeared beside us, his smile stretching wider than humanly possible. Clever ones, yes, 3 who know, 3 who accept, 3 who choose to join the feast, forever. I looked at my watch, 3:15 p.m., minutes remaining. I'll take the first point, Anderson said quietly. I understand now, what it wants, what it needs. The second point, Thompson fought through his darkness. Better to choose it than be taken. I nodded. I'll take the third, but we do this right. We make it count. The entity writhed above us, anticipating. The possessed students moved faster, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. Through the auditorium windows, I could see the sky had gone completely black. The third seal breaks at 3:33, Davis said. Choose quickly, choose freely. We positioned ourselves at 3 points of the symbol, forming our own binding circle. The counter ritual would require perfect timing, perfect understanding, and perfect acceptance of what we were about to become. The entity reached for us with its impossible limbs. The puppet student began to laugh, and somewhere in the darkness below, something ancient and hungry stirred, waiting to see if we would succeed where all others had failed. 3:33 p.m., the moment everything changed. The entity loomed above us, its mass now filling most of the auditorium. Anderson stood at the first point, Thompson at the second, and I took my position at the third. The possessed students had formed a perfect circle around us, their chanting reaching an impossible pitch. Begin, the puppet student commanded, his voice echoing with the power of centuries. Anderson went first, speaking the words from the journal with perfect clarity. I choose this. I understand what dwells below. I accept the darkness freely. Black liquid consumed him, but he didn't scream. His eyes turned dark, but there was peace in his expression. Thompson followed, fighting through his possession to make the choice his own. I choose this. I understand the hunger. I accept the joining freely. The entity wrapped around him like a cocoon, and he smiled as the darkness took him. My turn. The final point. I could feel the power building, the ancient geometry of the binding circle humming with energy. The puppet student watched, his smile wider than ever. Davis stood witness, his black eyes reflecting the chaos around us. I choose this, I began, the words burning in my throat. I understand the spaces between. I accept the eternal freely. The entity surged forward, and in that moment, I saw everything. Every sacrifice, every ritual, every attempt to contain what lived beneath Roosevelt High. I saw the native tribes who first discovered it, the settlers who ignored their warnings, the town built to bind it, the school constructed to seal it. The counter-ritual took hold. Light exploded from the 3 points we marked, forming lines of power that connected us. The entity screamed, not in pain, but in victory. It had what it wanted. 3 willing sacrifices, 3 souls given freely, with full understanding of what it meant. The possessed students collapsed like puppets with cut strings. The black liquid retreated, drawn back into the earth. The awful grinding sound faded, and the air cleared. But we remained, changed, transformed, part of something ancient and eternal. They found the auditorium empty when they finally breached the school. No sign of the entity, no trace of what happened. The students and teachers recovered, remembering nothing. Official reports blamed mass hysteria, gas leaks, anything that made sense. But we're still here, in the walls, in the spaces between, keeping the hunger contained, but only barely, the price of our sacrifice. Sometimes, late at night, you might catch a glimpse of us in Roosevelt High's empty halls. 3 figures walking their eternal patrol. Our eyes are dark now, but we remember who we were, what we chose, what we became. The entity sleeps again, bound by our willing sacrifice, but the hunger never truly dies. The seals will weaken, another generation will face the horror beneath Roosevelt High, and we'll be waiting, watching, warning those who might understand. If you're reading this, know that we made our choice freely. We accepted what we became. And if you ever hear whispers in the dark halls of Roosevelt High, if you ever see shadows move against the light, remember we're still here, keeping watch, keeping the hunger bound forever.